Hello there and welcome to the Sleepy Economics channel. Tonight we drift into the quiet ledger of centuries, into the pages where fortunes were once written in bold, confident ink, only to fade, smudge, and vanish. Economic collapses feel, at first, like sharp and sudden things. A crash, a headline, a single terrible day. But if you slow down and look closely, almost every collapse in human history was built slowly, quietly, over years of hope, habit, and belief, long before anyone noticed the cracks. Every civilization that has ever traded, borrowed, or lent has eventually discovered the same lesson, that confidence is a fragile currency, more fragile even than the coins and paper it supports. Tonight, we will wander gently through some of history's most famous economic collapses, from ancient debt to speculative bubbles to the failures of great banks, not to frighten you, but to remind you how endlessly human this pattern is. If stories like this help you drift off, consider leaving the video a like or subscribing, so more slow evenings like this one can find their way to you. For now, let your shoulders soften into whatever you're resting on. Let your breathing slow and lengthen, and let your thoughts loosen, one by one, like ships slipping their moorings. There is nothing to do right now except listen and drift, and let history carry you gently towards sleep. Let's begin. A Mesopotamian king once wiped away an entire kingdom's debts with a single royal decree. In the river valleys of ancient Sumer, farmers borrowed grain and silver from temple storehouses and wealthy lenders, pledging next year's harvest, their tools, sometimes even their own children, as collateral against bad seasons. When droughts came, debts piled higher than any harvest could repay, and entire villages slid quietly toward bondage. So rulers like Hammurabi began issuing clean slate decrees, canceling debts and freeing debt slaves, resetting the whole fragile system before it could collapse under its own weight. It is a strange comfort to know that even 4,000 years ago, people understood that debt, left unchecked, eventually breaks the very society that created it. Imagine standing in a dusty market in ancient Babylon, clay tablets stacked beside you, each one a tiny promise etched in wet clay and left to harden into law. These tablets recorded loans of barley and silver, due dates, interest rates, and the names of guarantors who vouched for a borrower's honesty. When bad harvests struck 2 or 3 years in a row, the whole town's tablets became a quiet catalog of impossible promises. Officials had to weigh mercy against order, deciding how much forgiveness a fragile economy could survive without collapsing into chaos entirely. Long before paper money or banks, humans had already discovered that a promise, once broken enough times, stops being worth the clay it was written on. Across 2 centuries, emperors facing wars, plagues, and swollen armies quietly reduced the silver content in the denarius, mixing in cheaper metal while keeping the coin's face value exactly the same. At first, ordinary people barely noticed, but prices for bread, wine, and cloth began creeping upward year after year, refusing to settle back down. By the 3rd century, the coinage had become so debased that merchants began weighing coins instead of simply counting them, trusting metal more than government promise. It is a gentle, sobering thought that an empire's confidence and its currency tend to erode at almost exactly the same quiet pace. A Roman senator once complained that no one trusted money anymore, only grain and land. As debasement deepened, wealthy Romans shifted their savings into farmland, olive oil, and stores of wheat, anything with a body and a weight, rather than a coin whose value seemed to slip a little more each season. This retreat from money starved the cities of trade and taxation, weakening the very empire the coins were meant to serve. Historians still debate how much this slow monetary decay contributed to Rome's eventual fracture into smaller, poorer, more local economies. There is something timeless in watching people quietly return to solid things: land, grain, stone, whenever paper promises begin to feel too thin. Han Dynasty China once tried to replace bronze coins with pieces of white deerskin. Around 2,000 years ago, an emperor facing a strained treasury introduced a currency made from rare white stag hide, valued at an enormous sum and required for certain ceremonial payments among nobles. Because only the imperial parks held white deer, the emperor effectively controlled the entire supply of this new money, forcing nobles to buy it from him at extraordinary cost. Scholars at the time quietly noted how strange it was to call something money simply because an emperor declared it so. It is a small, curious echo of a lesson every economy eventually relearns: that money is ultimately just a story everyone agrees to believe, until, one day, they don't. A famine in ancient Egypt turned grain into a currency more powerful than gold. Along the Nile, harvests depended entirely on the river's yearly flood, and when the flood failed, grain reserves stored in state granaries became the only wealth that truly mattered to a hungry population. Pharaohs and officials who mismanaged these reserves during lean years faced unrest, and some dynasties weakened permanently after a string of poor floods drained public trust along with public stores. Priest officials known for wise grain management were remembered for generations, almost like early bankers of survival itself. Even in the driest, oldest stories, we find the same truth waiting patiently. An economy is only as strong as its ability to feed people through a bad year. Imagine a merchant in ancient Athens, watching his entire fortune sail away on a single ship. Athenian trade depended on maritime loans, where lenders financed a ship's cargo and only got repaid if the voyage succeeded, sharing the enormous risk of storms, pirates, and shipwreck alongside the merchant himself. When a bad storm season struck the Aegean, several lenders lost fortunes overnight, and confidence in maritime lending would freeze for a year or two afterward. Yet the system always crept back, because trade was simply too valuable and too tempting for Athenians to abandon for long. There is something quietly reassuring in how consistently people return to risk once fear has had enough time to fade. A Chinese emperor once printed so much paper money that it became nearly worthless overnight. Centuries after inventing paper currency, Yuan Dynasty China issued enormous quantities of paper notes to fund wars and public works, initially backed loosely by reserves of silver and silk that the government promised to honor. As printing accelerated far faster than the underlying reserves could grow, prices for rice, salt, and cloth soared, and merchants grew reluctant to accept the notes at all. By the dynasty's final decades, some markets quietly reverted to barter, trusting grain and cloth over the emperor's own printed promises. It is a strange, gentle irony that the world's first paper money also produced one of history's first great paper collapses. The Byzantine gold coin stayed trustworthy for 700 years, then quietly failed. The solidus, a gold coin first minted under Emperor Constantine, held its purity for centuries, becoming the most trusted currency across the Mediterranean world. Merchants from Persia to Western Europe accepted it without question, a rare case of monetary stability lasting longer than most empires themselves. But as Byzantine finances weakened under war and shrinking territory, emperors began quietly debasing the coin, and its centuries of trust unraveled within a single lifetime. It is humbling to think that even 700 years of reliability can dissolve once desperation convinces a government to cut corners just once too often. Imagine a Roman marketplace where merchants began refusing coins with a suspicious yellow tint. As debasement spread, sharp-eyed traders learned to test coins by biting them, scratching them, or weighing them carefully in small bronze scales. Coins that felt too light or looked too pale were quietly rejected or accepted only at a discount, undermining the very idea of a single trusted currency. Eventually, entire regions developed their own informal exchange rates for good versus bad coins, a quiet, grassroots correction to a government's dishonesty. Ordinary people, it turns out, have always been the last and most careful line of defense against a currency's slow decay. A famine-driven debt crisis once forced entire villages in the Roman provinces into serfdom. Small farmers who borrowed seed and tools from wealthy landowners during difficult harvests often fell permanently behind on repayment, gradually trading away their freedom, plot by plot, in exchange for continued survival. Over generations, this quiet, unglamorous process concentrated enormous tracts of land into fewer and fewer hands, reshaping the entire rural economy. Historians view this slow rural indebtedness as one of the lesser-known root causes behind Rome's eventual economic fragmentation. It is a soft reminder that some collapses arrive not as a single crash, but as centuries of quiet, grinding erosion. Imagine a scribe in ancient Nineveh recording interest rates as carefully as prayers. Assyrian and Babylonian lenders charged interest that could reach 20% or more on grain loans, a rate that felt reasonable in good years and crushing in bad ones. When several harvests failed in succession, that same interest rate could double or triple a family's original debt within a few short seasons. Temples and palaces occasionally stepped in with partial forgiveness, understanding that a debt too large to repay was, in practice, no debt at all. Even in the earliest written laws we possess, humanity was already wrestling with the same delicate balance between fair lending and quiet ruin. Several ancient Greek states borrowed heavily from the treasury at Delphi, pledging future tax revenues or even city assets as security for the loans. When wars or poor harvests emptied a city's coffers, some states simply stopped repaying, risking not just financial penalty, but the anger of the gods the temple represented. Historians count numerous such defaults among Greek city-states, suggesting that sovereign debt crises are far older than the modern nations we usually associate them with. It is oddly comforting, in a quiet way, to know that governments have been finding reasons not to repay each other for well over 2,000 years. By the close of antiquity, one lesson had already been learned and forgotten many times over. Trust, once broken by debasement, default, or famine, took far longer to rebuild than it had taken to destroy. Merchants, farmers, and rulers across a dozen ancient civilizations discovered this same fragile equation independently, with no letters exchanged between them, no shared textbook to consult. And yet the pattern repeated itself, again and again, on riverbanks and coastlines thousands of miles apart. As we drift now toward the candlelit centuries of early modern Europe, that same ancient lesson is about to be learned all over again. this time with tulip bulbs instead of grain. A single tulip bulb once sold for more than a grand house on an Amsterdam canal. In the 1630s, the Dutch Republic fell in love with tulips imported from the Ottoman Empire, prizing rare, flame-streaked petals above almost anything else. Traders began buying and selling not just bulbs, but contracts for bulbs still buried in the ground, promises to deliver flowers that did not yet exist. Prices for the rarest varieties climbed so high that a single bulb could be traded for a skilled craftsman's yearly wages, or more. It is a gentle, almost dreamlike thing to imagine a flower briefly outvaluing a house, if only for a single golden season. Imagine a Dutch tavern in the depths of winter, thick with pipe smoke and whispered bulb prices. Ordinary craftsmen, weavers, and innkeepers gathered in these smoky rooms to trade tulip futures, often without ever touching an actual bulb. Fortunes seemed to double overnight, and modest tradesmen began dreaming of retiring on flowers they had never even seen bloom. But contracts require buyers who still believe, and belief, however sincere, cannot bloom forever without real flowers to back it. There is something tender in imagining ordinary people, warmed by candlelight and hope, certain they had finally found an easy fortune. In February of 1637, tulip buyers simply stopped showing up to an auction in Haarlem.
No single dramatic event caused it. No war, no famine, no royal decree. Only a quiet failure of buyers to appear at the price sellers expected.
Word spread through the trading houses within days, and confidence, which had climbed for years, evaporated within a single week. Prices for even the rarest bulbs collapsed by 90% or more, leaving traders holding contracts worth a fraction of what they had promised to pay. It is humbling how quietly the largest collapses often begin, not with a crash, but with an empty room where buyers used to stand. A wealthy Dutch merchant once traded 12 acres of land for a single tulip bulb. Historical records, though sometimes exaggerated by later storytellers, describe extraordinary barters during the mania's peak. Houses, cattle, and land changing hands for flowers. Whether every such tale is entirely accurate or slightly embellished by later writers, the underlying truth remains remarkably well documented. Ordinary objects were briefly transformed into extraordinary treasure simply because enough people agreed, for a season, to believe they were. Tulip Mania endures not because flowers are foolish, but because it shows, so plainly, how contagious belief in rising prices can become. Imagine a ship's captain unknowingly eating a fortune for breakfast. A popular, oft-repeated tale describes a sailor mistaking a rare tulip bulb for an onion and eating it with his herring, unaware of its extraordinary value. Whether wholly true or partly legend, the story captured something real about the mania. Value existed only in the eyes of those who understood the game being played. To someone outside the frenzy, a bulb was simply a bulb, an onion among onions, worth nothing more than a modest meal. Every bubble, it seems, eventually meets someone outside its spell, blinking in confusion at what everyone else was so certain mattered. Long after the tulip crash, Dutch courts still argued over unpaid flower debts. Because so many trades had been made on paper contracts rather than immediate cash, the legal fallout from the crash lingered for years after the bulbs themselves had wilted. Judges eventually ruled that many of these speculative contracts were more like gambling debts than enforceable trade agreements, reducing what buyers owed sellers. This ruling softened the disaster considerably, allowing the Dutch economy, still strong in shipping and trade, to absorb the shock without lasting ruin. Sometimes it is not the bubble itself, but the quiet, patient work of untangling it afterward that determines how deep the damage truly runs. Nearly a century later, a Scottish economist convinced all of France to gamble on paper money.
In the early 1700s, John Law persuaded the French crown to back a new bank and a massive trading company with paper shares,
promising fabulous wealth from imagined riches in the Mississippi territories of colonial North America. Shares in his Mississippi company soared so dramatically that the French word for millionaire is said to trace back to this very speculative frenzy. For a brief, dazzling moment, an entire nation believed that paper alone could conjure endless wealth from a swamp none of them had ever seen. Imagine crowds so large in Paris that a man was trampled simply trying to buy company shares. Streets outside the Mississippi Company's offices grew so crowded with eager investors that guards had to manage the surging mobs, and rumors spread of fortunes made overnight by servants, tailors, and shopkeepers who had bought shares early. Law's bank printed paper currency faster and faster to keep pace with demand, quietly loosening the link between the money and anything solid behind it. Even the most disciplined economies can lose their footing once printing presses start moving faster than public patience allows. By 1720, John Law's paper empire collapsed within a matter of months.
As doubts grew about the actual value of the Mississippi territories, investors rushed to convert their paper shares back into gold and silver,
overwhelming the bank's reserves almost instantly and forcing the French government to freeze withdrawals. Law fled France in disgrace, and the resulting chaos left the French monarchy's finances scarred for generations, feeding resentments that would echo decades later. It is sobering to consider how one clever, confident idea, taken too far too fast, can leave marks on a nation's memory for a lifetime. Across the English Channel, another bubble was inflating at almost exactly the same feverish moment. The South Sea Company in London promised investors extraordinary profits from a monopoly on trade with Spanish America, even though war and diplomatic tension made such trade largely theoretical rather than actual.
Share prices rose nearly tenfold within a single year, swept along by rumor, royal endorsement, and the simple electric excitement of watching prices climb.
It is remarkable how two entirely separate nations, an ocean width apart in distance but united in hope, built almost identical castles from almost identical air. Imagine a poet, a scientist, and a duke, all owning shares in the very same doomed company. Investors in the South Sea bubble spanned every level of English society, from aristocrats and members of parliament to writers, clergy, and shopkeepers. Even Sir Isaac Newton, one of history's sharpest scientific minds, bought and sold South Sea shares, reportedly losing a considerable sum when the bubble finally burst. Newton is said to have remarked afterward that he could calculate the motion of the stars, but not the madness of crowds. It is a gently humbling thought that genius offers no special immunity to the pull of a rising, glittering price. Smaller bubble companies sprang up across London, promising fortunes from schemes no one could quite explain. Alongside the South Sea Company, dozens of new ventures appeared almost overnight, some promising profits from vague or downright absurd undertakings.
One infamous prospectus reportedly promised a great undertaking of enormous advantage without revealing what that undertaking actually was, and still sold out within hours. Parliament eventually passed a law specifically to curb this frenzy of speculative company formation, worried it was destabilizing the wider economy.
Even 300 years ago, Lawmakers understood that unchecked enthusiasm, left alone, tends to consume itself and everyone standing nearby. When the South Sea bubble finally burst in the autumn of 1720, the fall was swift and merciless. Share prices collapsed from their summer highs within a matter of weeks, wiping out fortunes that had felt entirely secure only months before. Parliament launched investigations that revealed bribery among government officials who had helped inflate the company's reputation for personal gain. Several prominent figures were disgraced, some fleeing the country, others facing seized estates and public ruin. The word bubble itself, meaning a fragile, glittering thing destined to burst, entered everyday language, largely because of this single, spectacular collapse. These twin catastrophes across France and England left behind more than just ruined fortunes. They left a lingering caution about paper money and speculative shares that shaped economic policy in both nations for decades afterward. France grew wary of central banking innovations for nearly a century, while England tightened rules around forming new companies. Ordinary people, meanwhile, carried forward simple, hard-won wisdom passed quietly between generations, that rising prices alone are never proof of real, lasting value. As we drift onward now, toward the crowded trading floors of the 19th century, we will watch this same lesson learned yet again, in new cities, wearing new disguises. By the 1840s, Britain had gone mad for iron rails stretching toward every horizon. The steam railway, still a thrilling novelty, promised to shrink distances and multiply fortunes for anyone brave enough to invest early. Hundreds of new railway companies launched almost simultaneously, many proposing lines that overlapped, duplicated, or led nowhere particularly useful at all.
Investors from every class, clergymen, widows, clerks, poured their modest savings into railway shares, certain that iron and steam could not possibly fail.
It is a familiar feeling, watching a genuinely revolutionary invention convince an entire nation that caution has finally become unnecessary. Imagine a quiet English parlor where a vicar's widow signs away her savings for railway shares. Newspapers of the 1840s ran pages upon pages of railway prospectuses, each one promising dividends more generous than the last. Small investors, lacking the expertise to judge which lines were sound and which were reckless fantasy, often simply followed whichever names appeared most often in print. By 1846, over 1,000 new railway schemes had been proposed in a single parliamentary session alone. There is something quietly moving about how ordinary trust, multiplied by thousands of ordinary people, can build both magnificent railways and magnificent illusions at once. The railway mania collapsed not with a single crash, but with a long, grinding deflation, as it became clear that far too many lines had been proposed for the actual demand. Share prices began sinking steadily through 1847 and into 1848.
Many companies simply never completed construction, leaving investors with worthless paper and half-built embankments scattered across the countryside.
Yet, unlike the Tulip and South Sea collapses, this bust left behind something genuinely useful. Thousands of miles of working railway that reshaped Britain for a century. Even history's costliest mistakes, it seems, occasionally leave behind foundations sturdier than the folly that built them. Across the Atlantic, American banks began failing in the spring of 1837, one after another. Years of speculative lending on frontier land, fueled by wildly optimistic banknotes issued by hundreds of loosely regulated state banks, had built an economy resting on remarkably thin ice.
When President Andrew Jackson's administration tightened federal land payment rules and a cotton price collapse struck almost simultaneously, banks across the country ran short of hard currency.
Within weeks, banks in New York suspended payments in gold and silver, and the panic spread like a fever down the coast. It is a quiet, recurring truth that paper promises, however cheerfully printed, eventually meet a moment when everyone wants real metal at once. Imagine a farmer in Ohio holding a fistful of banknotes suddenly worth almost nothing. Hundreds of so-called wildcat banks on the American frontier had issued paper currency backed by little more than optimism and modest reserves. And when confidence broke in 1837, many of these notes became worthless within days, accepted by no one, redeemable nowhere. The resulting depression lasted years, with unemployment and business failures rippling through cities that had barely existed a generation before. It is a gentle, sobering thing to remember how young, hopeful economies are often the most vulnerable to their own enthusiasm. 2 decades later, a single failed insurance company set off a panic that circled the globe.
In 1857, the Ohio Life Insurance and Trust Company collapsed after risky investments went sour, an event that might once have stayed local.
But railroads, telegraphs, and international trade had woven American and European markets together more tightly than ever before, and the shock spread rapidly across the Atlantic. Banks in Britain and continental Europe felt tremors from a failure that, only 20 years earlier, would have stayed confined to a single American state. It is a striking, early glimpse of how connected the world's economies were quietly becoming, long before anyone called it globalization. The Panic of 1873 began, of all places, with a struggling railway financier in Philadelphia, J. Cook's banking firm, deeply invested in a struggling transcontinental railway project, suddenly collapsed under debts it could no longer service.
The failure triggered a wave of bank runs across the United States and contributed to a downturn so severe it was known for decades simply as the Great Depression, until a later crisis claimed that name instead.
Farmers, already squeezed by falling crop prices, faced years of hardship as credit tightened and unemployment climbed. History, it turns out, has a habit of recycling its harshest titles, handing them down to whichever collapse comes to feel worst at the time. Imagine a small-town bank in America's heartland, its doors locked, a handwritten notice pinned outside. During the Panic of 1873, thousands of businesses failed, and unemployment in some American cities reportedly reached 1 in 4 workers. Railroads, which had expanded far faster than actual freight demand justified, were among the hardest hit, with dozens of lines falling into bankruptcy. The resulting downturn lasted more than 5 long years in the United States, one of the longest sustained contractions the young nation had yet endured. Even in hardship, communities found quiet ways to endure, bartering, sharing, and waiting patiently for confidence to slowly return. Silver, once considered nearly as reliable as gold, quietly triggered another American panic in 1893. Uncertainty over whether the United States would remain on the gold standard or expand silver coinage unsettled investors both domestically and abroad. Foreign investors began withdrawing gold from American markets, straining bank reserves already stretched thin by railway overbuilding and agricultural distress. Hundreds of banks and thousands of businesses failed within the year, in what became one of the deepest depressions the country had experienced. It is remarkable how often a quiet disagreement over which metal to trust can ripple outward into a nationwide reckoning. Imagine unemployed workers marching on Washington, demanding relief from a depression no one in power could quite explain. Jacob Coxey led a modest army of unemployed men from Ohio to the nation's capital in 1894, asking for public works to ease the suffering.
Though the march itself achieved little immediate policy change, it marked one of the first organized protests demanding federal action during an economic collapse.
It planted an early seed of an idea that would blossom decades later, that governments bore some responsibility for cushioning their citizens against economic storms. Even the quietest protests, it seems, can plant ideas that take generations to fully bloom. A single cornered stock on a New York exchange nearly toppled the entire American banking system in 1907. An attempt to corner the market in a copper mining company's shares failed spectacularly, triggering a wave of bank runs across New York City.
Without any central bank to calm the panic, it fell to the private banker J.P. Morgan to gather fellow financiers and personally pledge enough gold to stop the bleeding.
The episode revealed, starkly, how dangerous it was for an entire nation's financial stability to depend on the goodwill of a handful of private individuals. It is a curious historical footnote that one man's personal fortune once stood between an entire nation and financial collapse. Imagine crowds outside a New York trust company, fists pounding on locked brass doors. During the panic of 1907, depositors lined up for blocks outside failing trust companies, desperate to withdraw savings before the doors closed for good. Newspapers described scenes of genuine panic, with police called in simply to manage the crowds outside institutions that had, only weeks earlier, seemed perfectly solid. The chaos convinced many lawmakers that America urgently needed a more permanent, institutional solution than relying on a single wealthy banker. Sometimes it takes watching an entire system nearly fail before people finally agree it needs rebuilding. That growing conviction led, in 1913, to the creation of the Federal Reserve System. Lawmakers designed a central banking system explicitly intended to act as a lender of last resort, smoothing panics before they could spiral into full collapse.
It was a direct, considered response to the recurring chaos of 1873, 1893, and especially 1907, each crisis teaching its own painful lesson.
Yet, as history would soon show, even a thoughtfully designed central bank could not, on its own, prevent every future storm. Institutions, however carefully built, are only ever as wise as the humans who steer them through the next unexpected squall. By the early 20th century, panics had grown less frequent, but no less capable of astonishing severity. Improved banking structures and new central institutions gave economies sturdier walls against the tremors of any single failure.
Yet those same walls, as the coming decades would prove, could not hold back a flood large enough when confidence itself finally gave way on a truly global scale.
Markets across continents were now linked closely enough that a crisis in one corner of the world could ripple outward within days rather than months. As we drift forward now, toward the autumn of 1929, we carry with us every lesson these earlier panics tried so patiently to teach. Grain prices, railway shares, and banknotes had each in turn taught the same repeating lesson. Confidence built slowly across years could unravel within a matter of weeks, sometimes days, once enough people began doubting at the very same moment. Governments had responded each time with new laws, new institutions, new promises to do better the next time such a storm arrived. And each time, for a while, the lessons seemed to hold, until memory faded and a new generation rediscovered the same old temptations. This is what makes the history of economic collapse so quietly, endlessly fascinating. It is never really about money at all, but about how briefly we remember. Wall Street's ticker tape simply could not keep pace with October 1929's collapsing prices. After nearly a decade of soaring stock prices fueled by borrowed money and boundless optimism, the market began sliding sharply in the final week of October.
On the day later remembered as Black Thursday, nervous selling turned into an avalanche, and ticker machines fell hours behind the actual trades happening on the floor.
Investors who had bought shares on borrowed margin found themselves owing far more than their shares were now worth. It is a strange, almost dreamlike thing to imagine an entire nation's fortune outrunning the very machines built to record it. Imagine a stockbroker's office in Manhattan, phones ringing without pause, ticker tape spooling endlessly onto the floor. Crowds gathered outside the New York Stock Exchange in the days that followed, watching in disbelief as fortunes evaporated within hours. Some investors had borrowed heavily to buy shares, and as prices fell, brokers issued margin calls demanding immediate repayment they simply could not provide. Within a single week, billions of dollars in paper wealth had vanished, though the deepest suffering was still, quietly, only beginning. There is something hauntingly still about photographs from those October days. Ordinary faces frozen in a kind of disbelief money rarely allows itself to show. The stock market crash alone did not cause the Great Depression, but it lit the first fuse. Banks that had lent heavily against inflated stock values now found themselves holding worthless collateral, and hundreds began failing within the following 2 years.
As banks collapsed, ordinary depositors lost savings entirely, since deposit insurance did not yet exist to protect them.
Consumer spending collapsed alongside business confidence, and factories that had produced goods for a booming decade suddenly found no buyers at all.
It is a quiet, cascading kind of disaster, each failure feeding the next, like dominoes too closely spaced to stop once the first one falls. Imagine a bread line stretching for blocks through the heart of an American city in winter. By 1933, unemployment in the United States had climbed above 25%, leaving millions of families without any steady income at all. Soup kitchens, often funded by charities or even wealthy individuals humbled by their own losses, became a familiar sight in cities that had recently celebrated record prosperity.
Families who had once owned homes and automobiles found themselves standing patiently in line for a single bowl of soup and a heel of bread.
It is difficult, even now, to sit gently with how quickly comfortable lives can be stripped down to their barest, most essential needs. Farmers across America's heartland faced a cruel irony: too much wheat, and no one able to buy it. Overproduction and collapsing prices left grain rotting in silos even as city dwellers went hungry, unable to afford what farmers could not sell. Meanwhile, a severe drought turned parts of the Great Plains into the infamous Dust Bowl, driving hundreds of thousands of farming families from land that could no longer sustain them.
Entire communities packed what little they owned and set out westward, seeking any work at all in California's fields and cities.
It is one of history's quieter tragedies that the same years brought both starvation in cities and wasted abundance in the fields nearby. Imagine a dust storm rolling across Oklahoma like a wall of solid, choking darkness. Families in the Dust Bowl region watched entire seasons of topsoil lift into the sky, burying farm equipment and choking livestock in fine, endless dust.
Many had no choice but to abandon land their families had worked for generations, loading trucks with whatever possessions still fit.
Photographs from this era remain some of the most haunting visual records of economic hardship ever captured. We can acknowledge this suffering honestly and gently, and let it remind us how deeply economic collapse can reach into soil, weather, and the most basic rhythms of daily survival. Banks failed so rapidly in early 1933 that incoming President Roosevelt ordered every one of them closed.
In his first days in office, Roosevelt declared a nationwide bank holiday, temporarily shutting every bank in the country to halt the panic and buy time for reform.
Officials examined each bank's health individually, reopening only those judged financially sound. A slow, deliberate process meant to rebuild shattered public trust. Roosevelt's calm radio addresses during this period, later called fireside chats, helped restore a measure of public confidence in the banking system itself. Sometimes the most powerful economic medicine is not a policy at all, but simply a calm, steady voice explaining what is actually happening. Out of this crisis came an entirely new promise: that ordinary depositors would never again lose their savings to a bank failure. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation was created in 1933, guaranteeing bank deposits up to a certain amount for the very first time in American history. This single institutional change did more than perhaps any other reform to prevent future bank runs from spiraling into full-blown panics.
Depositors who trusted that their modest savings were protected had far less reason to rush toward the bank at the first hint of trouble.
It is a gentle kind of genius, solving a problem of fear, not with more money, but simply with a believable promise. This is what makes the Great Depression so hauntingly instructive, even a century later. It showed, with unmistakable clarity, that markets left entirely to their own devices could spiral into suffering that lasted not months, but an entire decade. It also showed that thoughtful institutions, deposit insurance, unemployment support, careful banking oversight, could soften even history's deepest economic wounds. Many of the safeguards built during this period remained quietly in place for the rest of the 20th century, shaping how later generations weathered their own storms. Sometimes, our greatest institutional wisdom is born only from our greatest institutional failures. Imagine an elderly couple, decades later, still keeping cash hidden beneath a mattress out of old habit. Survivors of the Great Depression often carried lifelong habits of frugality, distrust of debt, and quiet anxiety about banks, long after prosperity returned. Economists have studied how an entire generation's spending and saving patterns were permanently reshaped by years of scarcity experienced in childhood or young adulthood. Even grandchildren who never experienced the Depression firsthand sometimes inherited these careful, watchful habits secondhand, passed quietly through family stories. Collective memory, it turns out, can linger in a family's habits for generations, long after the actual hardship has faded from living memory. The Depression did not stay confined within American borders for very long. Trade collapsed globally as nations raised tariffs to protect struggling domestic industries, inadvertently strangling the very international commerce that might have eased the crisis.
Germany, already weakened by earlier economic turmoil, suffered especially severe unemployment during this period, feeding political extremism that would soon reshape the entire world.
Britain, Japan, and much of Europe experienced their own painful contractions, each nation discovering how tightly the global economy had quietly become interwoven. It is sobering to realize how a single market's collapse can ripple outward across oceans, touching lives that never bought a single American share. Imagine an unemployed engineer in Weimar-era Berlin, watching his savings shrink to nothing twice within a single decade. Germany endured catastrophic hyperinflation in the early 1920s, only to face crushing unemployment again during the global depression less than 10 years later. This double blow left many ordinary Germans feeling that the entire economic order, banks, currency, government promises, could simply not be trusted at all. Historians widely consider this economic despair to be one of the conditions that allowed extremist political movements to gain such rapid, tragic footing. We can hold this history honestly and with care, recognizing how deeply economic collapse can reshape not just markets, but the entire course of nations. Slowly, unevenly, recovery finally arrived across the following decade. New government programs put people back to work building roads, dams, and public buildings, while reformed banking rules gradually restored public confidence. It took nearly a full decade, and for some economists, the true end of the Depression only arrived with the industrial demands of the following global conflict. Yet even gradual recovery mattered enormously to families who had spent a decade waiting, patiently, for ordinary life to feel possible again. Recovery from a great collapse, it seems, rarely arrives as a single triumphant morning, but as countless small, ordinary Tuesdays slowly adding up. This is what makes the story of 1929 endure so powerfully, even a century later. It remains the measuring stick against which every later economic collapse is instinctively compared, the deepest scar in modern economic memory. Yet perhaps its most lasting lesson is not about stock prices or bank failures at all, but about resilience quietly rebuilt, one careful reform at a time. Families endured, institutions were rebuilt, and an entire economic philosophy shifted toward preventing such depths of suffering ever again. As we drift onward now, into the strange arithmetic of hyperinflation, we carry this same gentle truth forward. Collapse is rarely the end of the story, only its most difficult chapter. A German shopper once needed a wheelbarrow simply to carry enough cash for a loaf of bread. In 1923, Germany's currency, the mark, collapsed so completely that prices doubled sometimes within a single day. Workers demanded to be paid twice daily, rushing to spend their wages before lunchtime prices made the morning's pay worthless by evening. Photographs from this era famously show children stacking worthless banknotes like building blocks, or people burning cash in stoves because it was cheaper than firewood. It is a strange, almost unbelievable image to sit with quietly, money becoming so plentiful that it lost nearly all meaning at all. Imagine a German pensioner watching a lifetime of careful savings become worthless within a single season.
Retirees who had spent decades setting aside modest sums for old age found their entire savings suddenly capable of buying little more than a postage stamp.
The hyperinflation wiped out the middle class's financial security almost entirely, deepening resentment toward a government many blamed for the crisis. Economists trace this catastrophe to war debts, reparations payments, and a government that printed money faster than any economy could reasonably absorb. We can acknowledge this suffering honestly, recognizing how deeply the loss of a lifetime's savings can wound a person's sense of security. Germany's central bank once operated more than 100 printing presses simply to keep pace with rising prices. By late 1923, the exchange rate between the German mark and the American dollar had reached numbers so large they became almost meaningless. New banknotes were issued in denominations of billions and eventually trillions, printed on paper often cheaper than the ink used upon it. The government eventually introduced an entirely new currency, backed cautiously by land and industrial assets, finally halting the spiral. It is remarkable how a nation can rebuild trust in money almost overnight, once it finally commits to genuine, disciplined restraint. Hungary endured a hyperinflation even more extreme than Germany's, just 2 decades later. In 1946, following the devastation of the Second World War, Hungary's currency lost value so quickly that prices reportedly doubled every 15 hours at the crisis's peak. The government eventually issued a banknote representing an almost unimaginably large number, before finally replacing the currency entirely with a new, stable one. Stabilization came swiftly once implemented, showing that even the most extreme spirals can be halted with sufficiently disciplined monetary reform. It is a quiet comfort to know that even history's most extreme collapses have, eventually, found their way back toward order. Imagine a Hungarian shopkeeper adjusting prices in chalk several times before a single customer even finished browsing. Shop owners during this crisis often quoted prices only in foreign currency or gold, refusing the collapsing local notes entirely by the crisis's final weeks. Wages, when paid at all, were sometimes distributed twice daily, mirroring the same desperate rhythm Germany had experienced decades before. The eventual stabilization plan pegged the new currency carefully to a fixed quantity of gold, rebuilding confidence with patient, deliberate steps. There is something reassuring in how consistently the cure for runaway inflation involves the same simple ingredients: discipline, patience, and a believable promise. Decades later, an African nation would print a banknote worth 100 trillion of its own currency.
Zimbabwe experienced severe hyperinflation in the late 2000s, following years of economic mismanagement and a sharply contracting economy.
At its peak, prices are estimated to have doubled roughly every day, forcing the government to issue banknotes with numbers few people could easily comprehend.
Ordinary citizens eventually abandoned the local currency altogether, conducting daily transactions instead in American dollars or South African rand.
It is a striking, sobering echo across nearly a century, the same basic pattern repeating itself on a different continent in a different decade. Imagine a Zimbabwean teacher's entire monthly salary buying barely a loaf of bread by month's end. Public sector workers, including teachers and nurses, found their wages losing meaningful value within weeks of being paid, undermining basic public services across the country. Many skilled professionals emigrated during this period, seeking stable currencies and predictable wages in neighboring countries. Zimbabwe eventually abandoned its own currency entirely for nearly a decade, adopting foreign currencies to restore basic economic stability. We can hold this history with care, recognizing how deeply currency collapse can hollow out even a nation's most essential public services. Yugoslavia, in the early 1990s, experienced one of history's longest sustained hyperinflations. As the country fractured amid political crisis and international sanctions, its currency lost value continuously for well over a year, rather than in a single dramatic burst. Citizens grew accustomed to prices changing multiple times within a single day, carrying bags of near-worthless banknotes simply to buy groceries.
The crisis finally ended with a currency reform that, like so many before it, pegged the new money firmly to a trusted foreign standard.
It seems that whenever trust in a currency dissolves completely, the remedy is almost always the same. Borrow trust from somewhere else, until your own can slowly regrow. Imagine a Belgrade grandmother trading old family jewelry simply for a week's worth of groceries.
Barter and foreign currency quietly replaced the local money for many ordinary transactions during Yugoslavia's inflationary crisis. Families who had carefully saved for generations found those savings meaningless almost overnight, a familiar and heartbreaking pattern by this point in our story. Yet even amid such upheaval, communities found quiet, resourceful ways to support one another through informal trade and mutual aid. There is something gently admirable in how consistently people rediscover barter, trust, and neighborly exchange whenever formal money fails them. This is what makes hyperinflation so uniquely unsettling among all forms of economic collapse, unlike a stock market crash, which mostly wounds those who chose to invest. Hyperinflation touches everyone equally, the cautious saver as much as the reckless speculator. It punishes patience and rewards nothing except perhaps the instinct to spend money immediately before it loses value entirely.
Every hyperinflation in recorded history shares the same root cause: a government printing far more money than its economy could genuinely support.
And every one of them, eventually, has ended the very same way, through discipline, a new currency, and the slow, patient rebuilding of trust. Venezuela experienced its own severe hyperinflation, beginning in the mid-2010s, driven by collapsing oil revenues and expansive money printing. Prices reportedly rose by staggering percentages annually at the crisis's worst point, eroding savings and wages with extraordinary speed. Millions of Venezuelans emigrated to neighboring countries during this period, seeking economic stability their homeland could no longer provide.
The government eventually introduced new currency denominations, and later a fully redesigned currency, echoing remedies attempted by nations decades before.
We can acknowledge this recent history honestly and gently, without judgment of any particular government, simply as one more chapter in an old, recurring human story. Imagine a Caracas market vendor weighing banknotes on a scale rather than counting them individually. With denominations losing meaning so quickly, some vendors reportedly found it faster to weigh large stacks of near-worthless currency than to count each note by hand. Digital payments and foreign currency transactions gradually became far more common than physical cash for many ordinary purchases. The crisis reshaped an entire generation's relationship with money, savings, and long-term financial planning in ways likely to linger for decades. Even the strangest, most modern-seeming details of a currency collapse tend to rhyme, quietly, with stories nearly a century old. Across every hyperinflation we have wandered through tonight, from Weimar Germany to modern Venezuela, one thread remains unbroken. Governments print money to solve an immediate crisis, only to create a much larger one further down the road. Citizens adapt with remarkable resourcefulness, whether trading jewelry, weighing banknotes, or fleeing entirely toward more stable currencies abroad.
And eventually, stability returns only once a government finds the discipline to stop and the humility to rebuild trust slowly, one careful policy at a time.
As we drift onward now, toward the sovereign debt crises of the 20th century, we will see this same fragile trust tested once again, this time between entire nations rather than within them. An entire continent once borrowed heavily against oil wealth that never quite arrived as promised. Throughout the 1970s, Latin American nations borrowed enormous sums from international banks, flush with cash from oil-exporting countries seeking somewhere profitable to invest. Loans financed roads, dams, and industrial projects, fueled by confident assumptions that steady economic growth would easily cover the repayments.
When global interest rates rose sharply at the decade's end, those same loans suddenly became far more expensive to service than anyone had anticipated.
It is a quiet, familiar rhythm by now, confident borrowing in good years meeting a harsh reckoning once conditions shift. In 1982, Mexico announced it could no longer make payments on its enormous foreign debts.
This single announcement triggered what became known as the Latin American debt crisis, as lenders suddenly refused to extend further credit to the entire region.
Argentina, Brazil, and numerous other nations soon found themselves in similarly desperate positions, unable to refinance debts that had once seemed perfectly manageable. The resulting decade of economic stagnation across the region became known, quite starkly, as the lost decade by economists and citizens alike. It is sobering to consider how a single missed payment in one capital city can quietly reshape an entire decade for millions of people. Imagine a Mexico City official calculating, late into the night, exactly how little money remained to pay foreign lenders. Finance ministers across the region spent years negotiating restructured debt terms with international banks and institutions, seeking any arrangement that might ease the burden. Ordinary citizens experienced painful austerity measures, reduced public spending, rising unemployment, and inflation that ate steadily into already stretched household budgets.
Yet through patient, often painful negotiation, most nations eventually restructured their debts and slowly regained access to international credit markets.
We can hold this history gently, recognizing both the genuine hardship endured and the quiet resilience shown by those who lived through it. International lending institutions introduced new plans throughout the 1980s to help untangle this enormous web of sovereign debt. Economists and finance ministers developed structured approaches allowing countries to exchange old, unpayable debts for new bonds with more manageable terms. These arrangements, though imperfect and often criticized, gradually helped stabilize economies that had spent nearly a decade in painful limbo. By the early 1990s, several Latin American nations had begun cautiously returning to modest, sustainable economic growth. It is a patient, unglamorous kind of triumph, an entire region slowly climbing back from a decade underwater. Argentina, in particular, would revisit this same difficult lesson multiple times across subsequent decades. After stabilizing in the 1990s, through a currency firmly pegged to the American dollar, Argentina faced renewed crisis when that peg finally proved unsustainable in 2001. Banks froze withdrawals, unemployment soared, and the government eventually defaulted on billions of dollars in international bonds. Argentines protested in the streets, banging pots and pans together in a memorable, rhythmic expression of collective frustration. Some nations, it seems, must relearn the same painful lesson more than once before it settles permanently into institutional memory. Imagine an Argentine family, life savings frozen inside a bank they could no longer freely access.
The 2001 crisis saw ordinary citizens queue for hours outside banks, desperate to withdraw even modest sums for daily necessities.
Barter clubs and informal local currencies briefly emerged across Argentine neighborhoods, echoing similar grassroots solutions from crises we have already wandered through tonight. Slowly, painfully, Argentina restructured its debts and rebuilt its economy, though further difficulties would arise again in later years. There is a quiet dignity in how communities, again and again throughout history, invent small local solutions while larger institutions slowly repair themselves. Across the ocean, Asian economies faced their own sudden reckoning in the summer of 1997. Thailand's currency collapsed after years of borrowing heavily in foreign currencies to fund rapid, ambitious economic expansion.
Investors, suddenly nervous, withdrew capital rapidly from Thailand and neighboring economies, causing currencies across the region to plunge within weeks.
Indonesia, South Korea, and Malaysia all experienced severe currency and banking crises that became known collectively as the Asian financial crisis. It is remarkable how quickly confidence, once it begins retreating in one country, can sprint across an entire region within a matter of days. Imagine a Bangkok office tower, half its floors suddenly empty after a construction boom collapsed overnight. Years of ambitious building projects across Southeast Asia had been financed with short-term foreign loans, assuming currencies would remain stable indefinitely. When those currencies suddenly devalued, the cost of repaying foreign debts roughly doubled overnight for many businesses and banks. Numerous construction projects were abandoned mid-build, leaving skeletal, unfinished towers scattered across several Asian cities for years afterward. We can acknowledge this hardship honestly, recognizing how quickly an ambitious boom can leave behind quiet, unfinished monuments to overconfidence. South Korea, remarkably, recovered from its 1997 crisis faster than almost any economist predicted. Ordinary citizens voluntarily donated gold jewelry and heirlooms to help the government rebuild its foreign currency reserves, a genuinely moving display of collective sacrifice. Combined with disciplined economic reforms and international financial support, South Korea repaid its emergency loans years ahead of schedule. The nation's economy not only recovered, but emerged with stronger, more resilient financial institutions than it had possessed before the crisis. It is a genuinely touching thought, an entire nation's grandmothers quietly parting with wedding rings to help steady their country's finances. Imagine a modest sole apartment, a small pile of gold rings and necklaces set gently on a kitchen table. Long lines formed outside collection centers as ordinary Koreans donated family gold in a nationwide campaign to support economic recovery. Television broadcasts showed elderly citizens tearfully handing over jewelry passed down through generations, moved by a shared sense of national purpose. The campaign collected hundreds of tons of gold within just a few months, a remarkable testament to collective resolve. There is something quietly beautiful in watching an entire nation choose shared sacrifice over private hoarding, even amid genuine hardship. Russia, too, defaulted on its debts during this same turbulent period. In the summer of 1998, falling oil prices, fiscal mismanagement, and contagion spreading from the Asian crisis combined to overwhelm Russia's fragile post-Soviet financial system.
The ruble collapsed sharply, wiping out savings for ordinary Russians who had only recently begun adapting to a market-based economy.
International markets, still nervous from the Asian turmoil, felt further tremors as investors reassessed risk across emerging economies worldwide. It is a quiet reminder that economic crises, once contagious, rarely respect the careful borders drawn between separate nations. This is what makes the sovereign debt crises of the late 20th century so quietly illuminating. They reveal how thoroughly national economies had become woven together by international lending, foreign investment, and shared currency markets. A crisis born in Bangkok could unsettle Moscow within a single year, a connection unimaginable to the ancient lenders of Sumer or Rome. Yet the underlying lesson remained exactly the same as it always had. Borrowed confidence, however useful, must eventually be repaid in genuine trust. Even as the tools of finance grew ever more complex, The oldest lesson in this entire story refused to change even slightly. By the close of the 20th century, nations had grown far better at containing these crises, if not preventing them entirely. International institutions coordinated emergency loans more swiftly, and countries learned, often through painful experience, to hold larger currency reserves as a buffer against sudden shocks.
Yet as we drift now toward the final chapters of our story, into a new millennium of digital markets and interconnected banks, we will see that even these hard-won lessons could not prevent every future storm.
The tools change, the paperwork changes, the technology accelerates, but something patient and unhurried in human nature seems to stay remarkably the same. Let that thought settle gently now, as we turn toward the final, most modern collapses in our long, quiet history. Land beneath a single Tokyo palace was once said to be worth more than the entire state of California. Throughout the 1980s, Japanese real estate and stock prices climbed to extraordinary heights, fueled by cheap credit and an unshakable national confidence in perpetual growth. Banks lent enormous sums against land values that seemed capable of only ever rising, encouraging borrowers to leverage themselves further and further.
By 1989, Japan's stock market had reached valuations that, in hindsight, bore little relationship to any underlying economic reality.
It is a familiar, almost gentle irony how certainty about endless growth so often arrives just before growth quietly stops. Imagine a Tokyo executive proudly showing colleagues a golf club membership purchased for the price of a small house. During Japan's bubble years, exclusive golf club memberships and rare artworks became speculative investments in their own right, traded almost like stocks. Corporate executives competed to display extravagant purchases, believing rising asset prices made such spending not just possible, but genuinely wise.
Banks, eager to lend against this seemingly permanent prosperity, extended credit with remarkably little caution about underlying risk.
There is something almost tender in remembering how thoroughly an entire nation once believed its own prosperity was simply the new, permanent normal. Japan's central bank finally raised interest rates in 1989, and the bubble began deflating almost immediately. Stock prices fell sharply through 1990, and real estate values, once considered unshakable, began a long, slow decline that would last for years. Banks, burdened with loans secured against now collapsing property values, grew reluctant to lend, quietly starving businesses of the credit they needed to grow. What followed became known as Japan's lost decade, though many economists now consider it closer to 2 full decades of stagnant growth. Sometimes, the most painful collapses are not the loudest, dramatic crashes, but the quiet, patient decades of simply not quite recovering. Imagine a Japanese office worker in his 50s, watching decades of expected retirement security quietly evaporate. Many Japanese households had invested heavily in real estate and stocks, assuming steady appreciation would fund comfortable retirements.
As asset values stagnated for years, an entire generation adjusted their expectations toward more modest, careful, frugal lives than their parents had known.
Japan's experience became a widely studied cautionary tale about how deeply a burst asset bubble can reshape an entire society's outlook. We can hold this history with care, recognizing how patiently and how quietly a nation can absorb decades of disappointed expectations. A decade later, a very different kind of bubble was inflating on the opposite side of the world. Throughout the late 1990s, investors poured enormous sums into companies built around the still new commercial internet, often with little regard for actual profit or revenue. Share prices for companies whose entire business plan amounted to little more than a clever website soared to extraordinary heights within months of going public. The promise of a genuinely transformative new technology blurred, for many investors, into blind faith that any internet company could not possibly fail. It is a pattern we have wandered through before tonight. Genuine innovation quietly tangled together with unchecked, contagious enthusiasm. Imagine a young entrepreneur becoming, briefly, a paper millionaire before his company had ever earned a single dollar.
Numerous companies during this era achieved stock market valuations in the billions despite having no clear path toward profitability whatsoever.
Initial public offerings became so anticipated that some stocks doubled or tripled in value within their very first day of trading. Financial journalists at the time openly questioned whether traditional measures of company value even applied anymore in this new, exuberant market. There is something quietly familiar in watching genuine excitement about a real invention slowly curdle into speculation about almost anything wearing its name. In March of 2000, the technology-heavy stock index began a decline that would erase trillions in value.
Investors gradually realized that many of these companies had no realistic path toward the profits their soaring valuations implied.
Over the following 2 years, the technology sector lost the majority of its market value, and thousands of companies simply ceased to exist. Employees who had accepted stock options in lieu of higher salaries often found those options worthless within a matter of months. It is a quiet, recurring truth that when a story about the future outpaces the numbers actually supporting it, the numbers eventually, patiently, catch up. Imagine an office building emptied within a single afternoon, employees carrying cardboard boxes toward waiting elevators.
Mass layoffs swept through technology hubs as once celebrated startups folded, unable to raise the additional funding their business models depended upon.
Office furniture, computer equipment, and even entire company logos were sold at steep discounts as failed startups liquidated their remaining assets. Yet, amid this widespread collapse, a smaller number of genuinely well-run internet companies survived and eventually thrived for decades afterward. Every speculative bubble, it seems, leaves behind both wreckage and a handful of quiet survivors who prove the underlying idea was genuinely sound all along. The dot-com collapse taught investors a lesson uncomfortably similar to the tulip fields of 17th century Holland. A genuinely revolutionary technology, whether flowers, railways, or the internet itself, does not automatically make every company built around it a wise investment.
Enthusiasm for an underlying innovation can inflate prices far beyond what any individual company's actual prospects can support.
This gap between genuine technological promise and speculative excess would recur again and again in the decades that followed. This is what makes these bubbles so quietly, patiently instructive. The technology usually survives just fine, while only the excess eventually falls away. Housing prices in the United States climbed steadily and confidently through much of the early 2000s. Lenders extended mortgages to buyers with increasingly limited ability to repay them, often bundling these loans into complex financial products sold to investors worldwide.
Rating agencies frequently labeled these bundled mortgage products as remarkably safe, despite the increasingly shaky loans hidden within them.
Regulators and many economists at the time expressed relatively little concern, trusting that housing prices would simply continue their steady, comfortable climb. It is a familiar, gentle warning by now, whenever an entire market assumes prices can only rise. history quietly begins preparing its answer. Imagine a young couple in Nevada, approved for a mortgage far larger than their modest income could reasonably support. Lending standards loosened considerably during this period, with some loans requiring minimal proof of income or savings from borrowers. These loans were frequently packaged together into complex securities, then resold to banks and investors around the world seeking steady returns. Few of the institutions buying these securities fully understood the underlying risk hidden within the loans they now owned. There is a quiet unease in imagining thousands of ordinary, hopeful families, unknowingly, at the very center of a financial structure none of them had helped design. By 2007, home prices in the United States began falling for the first time in over a decade. Homeowners who had borrowed close to their home's full value found themselves owing more than their houses were now actually worth.
Mortgage defaults rose sharply, and the complex securities built upon these loans began losing value rapidly across global financial markets.
Banks that held enormous quantities of these now troubled securities began revealing losses of a scale few had previously imagined possible. It is remarkable and a little unsettling how a modest decline in ordinary home prices could ripple so powerfully through banks half a world away. This is what makes the years leading into 2008 so quietly haunting, even now. They combined nearly every lesson from our entire evening together tonight. Speculative excess, financial innovation outpacing understanding, and a stubborn collective belief that this time, prices really could only rise. What followed would become the most consequential global financial crisis since the Great Depression itself. As we drift now toward that final chapter, let your breathing stay slow and steady, knowing that even this enormous storm eventually, patiently, passed. History, it seems, is endlessly patient with us, even when we are not nearly so patient with ourselves. On a quiet September morning in 2008, one of Wall Street's oldest investment banks simply ceased to exist. Lehman Brothers, a firm with a history stretching back more than a century, filed for bankruptcy after losses tied to mortgage securities finally overwhelmed it entirely. No government rescue arrived this time, and the shock of watching such a storied institution collapse sent tremors through banks worldwide within hours.
Credit markets, the invisible plumbing through which businesses borrow to meet everyday expenses, suddenly seized up almost entirely.
It is a sobering thing to consider how a single Monday morning bankruptcy filing can ripple outward into every corner of a global economy within days. Imagine a trading floor gone eerily silent, phones unanswered, screens frozen on a single falling number. Employees at Lehman Brothers reportedly carried personal belongings out of the firm's headquarters in cardboard boxes, photographed by news crews gathered outside. Financial workers across the industry described the following weeks as unlike anything they had witnessed in their entire careers.
Other major institutions, some barely more stable than Lehman itself, scrambled desperately to secure emergency funding or hurried mergers with stronger rivals.
There is something quietly haunting about photographs from that single week, ordinary office boxes becoming, briefly, a symbol for an entire economic era ending. Governments around the world moved with unusual speed to prevent a complete collapse of the banking system.
In the United States, lawmakers approved a large rescue program to purchase troubled bank assets and inject capital directly into struggling financial institutions.
Central banks slashed interest rates and extended emergency lending to banks worldwide, attempting to keep credit flowing through a badly frozen system. Similar rescue efforts unfolded across Britain, much of continental Europe, and beyond, as officials recognized how deeply interconnected the crisis truly was. It is remarkable how quickly institutions built over decades of careful, incremental design can be mobilized within days once a crisis grows severe enough. Imagine a small manufacturing business, its bank suddenly refusing to renew a routine, ordinary loan. As credit markets froze, even healthy businesses with strong sales records found themselves unable to secure the short-term financing needed for everyday operations. Unemployment climbed steadily across the following 2 years, reaching levels not seen in most developed economies since the deep recessions decades earlier.
Millions of families experienced foreclosure as home values continued falling and household budgets grew increasingly strained.
We can acknowledge this widespread hardship honestly and gently, recognizing how deeply a financial crisis can reach into ordinary households far removed from any trading floor. One particular financial insurance company required an especially large emergency rescue to prevent a much wider collapse. AIG, a major global insurer, had sold enormous quantities of complex financial insurance contracts tied to mortgage securities, without holding adequate reserves against potential losses. When those underlying mortgages soured, AIG faced obligations far larger than it could possibly cover, threatening to drag down every institution it had insured. Regulators judged the company simply too interconnected with the broader financial system to be allowed to fail outright. It is a strange, quiet irony that a company built to insure against risk became, itself, one of the greatest risks the entire system faced. Imagine an economist working through the night, trying to map exactly how deeply one insurer's failure might spread. Officials spent frantic weekend hours calculating which institutions might collapse like dominoes if a rescue were not arranged in time.
The scale and speed of these emergency interventions were unprecedented in peacetime economic history, straining even well-established institutional playbooks.
Years later, these emergency loans were largely repaid, though the political and public trust costs of the rescues lingered considerably longer. There is something quietly remarkable about how much careful, invisible calculation goes into holding an entire financial system together during its most fragile hours. Housing markets across much of the developed world fell sharply throughout 2008 and into the following years. Families who had purchased homes near the market's peak often found themselves owing considerably more than their homes were now worth. Construction slowed dramatically, and industries connected to home building, from lumber suppliers to appliance manufacturers, faced steep declines in demand.
Recovery in housing markets took years in many regions, with some areas not returning to previous price levels for the better part of a decade.
It is a familiar, patient rhythm by now. A boom built on borrowed optimism eventually requires an equally patient, unhurried period of healing. Imagine a suburban street with several homes standing empty, lawns overgrown, foreclosure notices taped quietly to doors.
Entire neighborhoods across parts of the United States experienced waves of foreclosures, reshaping communities that had recently celebrated steady, comfortable growth.
Some families relocated in search of work, while others simply adjusted to smaller homes and considerably more modest expectations. Community organizations and local governments worked patiently over subsequent years to stabilize neighborhoods hit hardest by the crisis. We can hold this history gently, recognizing both the genuine hardship endured and the quiet, steady work of rebuilding that followed in its wake. New financial regulations emerged in the years following the crisis, aimed at preventing a similar collapse from recurring.
Lawmakers in the United States and Europe introduced stricter rules governing how much risk banks could take on and how much capital they needed to hold in reserve.
Regulators gained expanded authority to monitor large financial institutions whose failure might threaten the broader economic system. Many of these reforms remain in place today, forming a quiet, structural memory of the lessons the crisis so painfully taught. It seems that humanity's most durable economic wisdom nearly always arrives stitched together from the wreckage of its most recent mistake. This is what makes the 2008 crisis feel, even now, like a genuine turning point in economic memory. It combined nearly every thread we have followed tonight: speculative excess, complex financial innovation, and institutions so deeply interconnected that no single failure could stay contained. Unlike the Great Depression, this crisis unfolded within an economy far more globally intertwined, spreading its tremors across continents within mere days rather than months. Yet, much like every collapse before it, calm eventually returned, rebuilt slowly through patient reform and the quiet passage of time. Even our most interconnected, sophisticated modern economy, it turns out, still runs on the very same ancient fuel: trust, patiently built and just as easily spent. Not long after the global financial crisis eased, a smaller Mediterranean nation revealed debts far larger than anyone had realized. In late 2009, Greece's newly elected government disclosed that its budget deficit was considerably larger than previously reported, shaking confidence across European bond markets.
Investors, still nervous from the recent global crisis, began demanding much higher interest rates to continue lending to Greece at all.
Within months, the country found itself effectively unable to borrow at affordable rates, edging toward the very default it desperately hoped to avoid. It is a quiet, familiar echo of ancient Greek city-states borrowing from sacred treasuries, this time from bond markets rather than temples. Imagine an Athens civil servant learning, mid-shift, that government salaries would soon be cut by a significant percentage. European institutions and the International Monetary Fund extended emergency loans to Greece, contingent upon substantial cuts to public spending and pensions. Unemployment in Greece climbed to levels among the highest recorded in a developed European economy, with youth unemployment reaching especially painful heights. Protests filled the streets of Athens repeatedly over the following years, as citizens grappled with austerity measures many considered unjust or excessively harsh. We can hold this history with care, recognizing genuine hardship without assigning simple blame to any single side of a deeply complicated story. The crisis soon revealed similar fragility in several other European economies carrying heavy debt loads. Ireland, Portugal, Spain, and Cyprus each faced their own versions of this same underlying strain, requiring various forms of emergency financial support in turn. Markets began referring, somewhat unkindly, to these struggling economies as a group, a label that stung considerably for the nations involved. European leaders spent years in careful, often tense negotiations, working to hold a shared currency together despite such uneven economic footing among its members. It is a modern echo of ancient lessons. A shared currency, like a shared harvest, only works when every partner tends their portion with equal care. Imagine European finance ministers gathered around a long table in Brussels, negotiating deep into the night for the third consecutive summit. Years of complex negotiations produced multiple rescue packages for Greece, each one requiring further budget cuts in exchange for continued financial support. Greek citizens experienced years of economic contraction, with the country's overall economy shrinking by roughly a quarter from its pre-crisis size. Yet slowly, painstakingly, Greece eventually stabilized, exiting its final rescue program after nearly a decade of difficult reform. There is a quiet, hard-won dignity in watching a nation endure such a long, uncomfortable process and eventually emerge, however changed, still standing. This prolonged Eurozone crisis tested something genuinely new in economic history: a shared currency spanning many separate, sovereign governments. Unlike earlier crises confined within a single nation's own currency and central bank, the Eurozone's structure meant no single country could simply devalue its own way out of trouble.
This shared arrangement offered real benefits in ordinary times, but left individual nations with far fewer tools during a genuine crisis.
European institutions gradually built new mechanisms for shared financial support, learning, much like earlier generations, through difficult and costly experience. It seems that every new form of economic cooperation must, eventually, endure its own painful, formative crisis before its lessons become truly permanent. Imagine a small Cypriot depositor discovering that a portion of savings above a certain threshold would simply be seized to rescue local banks. Cyprus, in 2013, implemented an unusual and controversial measure directly affecting bank depositors as part of its own rescue arrangement.
This approach, though narrowly targeted, unsettled depositors across Europe, prompting renewed anxiety about the safety of bank deposits more broadly.
Ultimately, the measure helped stabilize Cyprus's banking system, though it left a lasting, uneasy mark on public trust in the region. Even in our most modern financial systems, it seems, the oldest fear of all quietly resurfaces: that one's own careful savings might not, after all, be entirely safe. By the middle of the last decade, most of these European economies had gradually returned to steadier footing. Growth resumed, unemployment slowly declined, and the shared currency, though tested severely, held together through the entire ordeal. Economists still debate which combination of austerity, reform, and external support ultimately mattered most in restoring stability. What remains widely agreed upon, however, is how deeply this crisis reshaped European economic policy and public trust for an entire generation. Recovery, once again, arrived not as a single triumphant announcement, but as years of quiet, patient, unglamorous rebuilding. This is what makes the Eurozone crisis such a fascinating chapter in our long evening's journey together. It showed that even the most carefully designed modern institutions, built by thoughtful economists with centuries of prior history to learn from, could still be tested to their very limits. Shared currencies, it turns out, require something even harder to build than gold reserves or clever policy: genuine, patient trust between very different nations. That trust, like every form of trust we have wandered through tonight, proved far slower to rebuild than it had been to lose. Even the newest chapters of economic history, it seems, are simply the oldest lessons, wearing slightly newer, more complicated clothes. A curious psychological pattern connects nearly every collapse we have wandered through tonight, whichever century or continent it happened in. Economists studying these episodes across centuries have noticed the same rough sequence recurring: a period of genuine innovation, followed by growing confidence, followed eventually by excess that outpaces the underlying reality. Whether the innovation was a new trade route, a railway, a currency, or a website, the emotional arc of the crowd around it looked remarkably similar each time. Historians sometimes call this recurring shape a mania cycle, moving gently from displacement to boom to euphoria, and finally to a quiet, sobering reckoning. It is oddly comforting to imagine that beneath every headline about a specific bubble lies the very same simple, ancient human shape. Imagine an ordinary investor, quite reasonably cautious, slowly persuaded by a neighbor's growing enthusiasm at a dinner party. Economists have long studied how confidence spreads socially, one person's growing certainty gently nudging a friend, a colleague, a whole street of neighbors toward the same belief. This social contagion helps explain why bubbles so often gather steam gradually, then suddenly accelerate once enough ordinary people feel they are being left behind. The economist John Maynard Keynes once compared this dynamic to a beauty contest, judged not on true beauty, but on guessing what others will vote for. There is something gently humbling in recognizing how much of any market's rise or fall depends simply on what we believe our neighbors believe. A phrase economists use to describe late-stage bubble buying is the greater fool theory, and it appears again and again tonight.
This idea suggests that some investors knowingly buy an overpriced asset, not because they believe its true value, but because they expect an even greater fool to buy it from them later, at a higher price still.
This works beautifully for a while, right up until the supply of greater fools finally runs dry. Every collapse we have visited tonight, from tulip bulbs to .com shares, eventually reached this same quiet, empty room where no greater fool remained. It is a curious thing how an entire economy can rest, briefly, on nothing sturdier than optimism about someone else's optimism. Imagine standing at the very edge of a bubble's peak, uncertain whether to keep believing or quietly step away. Historical accounts consistently describe a strange, uneasy period just before every major collapse, where a small minority begins expressing doubt while the majority continues confidently buying. These early skeptics are often mocked or ignored entirely, dismissed as overly cautious or simply unable to understand a genuinely new era.
Yet, in nearly every case we have followed tonight, those quiet skeptics were eventually proven right, sometimes by mere months, sometimes by mere weeks.
There is a gentle, recurring lesson here. The loudest confidence in any market is rarely the same thing as the soundest judgment. Regulators and central bankers have spent centuries building tools meant to soften these recurring cycles, with genuinely mixed success. Deposit insurance, capital requirements, interest rate policy, and careful banking supervision have each, in their own era, prevented certain crises from spreading as far as earlier ones once did.
Yet no tool devised so far has fully eliminated the underlying human tendency to grow overconfident during good times and fearful during bad ones.
Each generation of policymakers inherits the lessons of the previous crisis, while somehow still discovering entirely new ways for confidence to overreach itself. It seems the deepest challenge in economics has never really been mathematical at all, but profoundly, stubbornly human. Imagine a young economist, decades from now, studying tonight's stories as ancient history, the way we study Rome or Sumer. It is worth remembering that every collapse we have discussed tonight once felt, to those living through it, like the most modern, unprecedented crisis imaginable. The Dutch trading tulip futures had no history book to warn them. The Romans debasing silver had no earlier collapse to study as a cautionary tale. Each generation, in its own way, believes its own economic moment to be entirely new, even while quietly repeating patterns stretching back thousands of years. There is something quietly reassuring in that thought. Whatever economic story unfolds in our own lifetime, humanity has, in some form, weathered something remarkably similar before. Recovery, across every single collapse we have wandered through tonight, has always eventually arrived, however slowly or unevenly. Ancient Sumerian kings issued clean slate decrees. Dutch courts softened unenforceable tulip contracts. American reformers built deposit insurance. European leaders negotiated their way through a shared currency crisis, one difficult summit at a time. In every case, recovery required the same patient ingredients: honest acknowledgement of what had gone wrong, some form of shared sacrifice, and enough time for trust to quietly regrow. No collapse in recorded economic history has ever proven permanent, however devastating it felt to those enduring it in the moment. This is what makes economic history, taken as a whole, such a strangely hopeful subject to study late at night. Imagine every collapse tonight as a single wave in an impossibly long, patient tide, stretching back to the very first harvest loan. Waves rise, crest, and inevitably break, yet the tide itself continues rolling steadily forward, carrying trade, invention, and human cooperation along with it. Each collapse we have discussed tonight, however painful in its own moment, eventually became simply another layer of sediment beneath the next era's foundations. Civilizations that endured these collapses did not merely survive them, but often emerged with sturdier institutions, wiser regulations, and more resilient habits of caution. There is a gentle, oceanic patience in economic history, each wave teaching something the next one will eventually, quietly, need to remember. On a single Monday in October of 1987, global stock markets fell further in one day than almost anyone could recall. The Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped more than 20% in a single trading session, a decline so sharp it remains the largest one-day percentage fall in the index's history.
Analysts later pointed to new computerized trading programs, which automatically sold shares once prices dropped past certain levels, accelerating the plunge far faster than any human trader could have managed alone.
Remarkably, unlike so many collapses before it, the broader economy avoided a deep recession, and markets gradually recovered within roughly 2 years. It is a quietly reassuring exception to remember, tucked among tonight's heavier stories. Sometimes even history's sharpest single-day fall need not become history's deepest wound. Imagine a trading floor in 1987, brokers shouting over one another as prices scrolled downward faster than anyone could read them. Exchanges worldwide, from Tokyo to London to New York, experienced echoes of the same sudden plunge within the very same 24 hours. Regulators afterward introduced measures known as circuit breakers, temporarily halting trading during extreme volatility to give markets a chance to gather themselves.
These same circuit breakers remain in place today, a quiet, structural memory of a single frightening Monday nearly 4 decades ago.
Sometimes the gentlest lesson a crisis can leave behind is simply permission to pause, breathe, and let panic settle before acting. Throughout the 1980s, a slower, quieter crisis was unfolding within America's savings and loan institutions, largely away from newspaper front pages. Deregulation allowed these traditionally conservative lenders to pursue riskier investments, including speculative real estate and volatile corporate debt, often without adequate oversight.
By the late 1980s and early 1990s, hundreds of these institutions had failed, requiring a costly, taxpayer-funded rescue to protect depositors.
Unlike the dramatic single-day crashes we have discussed tonight, This crisis unfolded gradually, institution by institution, over the better part of a decade. Some collapses, it seems, arrive not as thunder, but as a slow, steady drizzle, easy to overlook until the entire landscape has quietly changed. Iceland, a small island nation of barely a few 100,000 people, experienced one of the most dramatic banking collapses of the modern era. In the years leading up to 2008, Iceland's three largest banks expanded so aggressively abroad that their combined assets grew to many times the size of the nation's entire economy.
When global credit markets froze that autumn, all three banks collapsed within the same single week, an almost unimaginable proportion relative to the country's small size.
The Icelandic government, unable to rescue banks so much larger than the state itself, allowed them to fail rather than risk bankrupting the entire nation. It is a striking, almost fable-like image. A nation small enough that its banks had, quite literally, grown too big for it to save. Imagine an Icelandic fisherman watching the national currency lose nearly half its value within a matter of weeks. Ordinary Icelanders faced steep price increases for imported goods, alongside a painful, sudden contraction in the broader economy. Iceland took an unusual path compared to many nations, allowing foreign creditors of the failed banks to bear significant losses rather than shielding them with public funds.
Remarkably, within less than a decade, Iceland's economy recovered strongly, aided partly by a currency now cheap enough to attract a flourishing tourism boom.
There is something quietly hopeful in watching a small, resilient nation absorb such an enormous shock and emerge, in time, sturdier than expected. Dubai, in 2009, revealed debts from ambitious construction projects far larger than global investors had anticipated. Years of building soaring towers, artificial islands, and luxury developments had been financed heavily through debt, assuming property values would continue climbing indefinitely.
When global credit tightened following the broader financial crisis, several major state-linked companies in Dubai struggled to meet their obligations, unsettling international investors.
Neighboring Abu Dhabi ultimately provided crucial financial support, allowing Dubai to restructure its debts without a full-blown default. It is a familiar shape by now, ambitious building, financed by confident borrowing, meeting a quieter, more cautious reality once credit tightens. Imagine gleaming, half-finished towers rising above a quiet desert, cranes standing motionless against the skyline for months at a time. Construction projects across Dubai paused amid the crisis, some remaining incomplete for years, before finally resuming once confidence gradually returned. The episode became a widely discussed case study in how quickly ambitious growth, financed largely by debt, can stall once external credit conditions shift. Dubai's economy eventually diversified further, recovering and continuing its ambitious development in the years that followed. Even the most futuristic skylines, it turns out, rest upon the very same ancient foundation of borrowed trust and patient repayment. China's stock markets experienced a sharp, sudden correction in the summer of 2015, unsettling investors who had grown accustomed to steady gains.
Rapid growth in Chinese equity prices, encouraged partly by widespread margin lending to ordinary retail investors, reversed sharply within a matter of weeks.
Authorities intervened with various measures intended to stabilize prices and restore investor confidence during the sharpest part of the decline. While the correction unsettled global markets briefly, China's broader economy continued its longer-term growth trajectory in the years that followed. Even rapidly growing, modern economies, it seems, are not immune to the same quiet rhythm of enthusiasm meeting correction that we have followed across so many centuries tonight. This is what makes these more recent, less legendary collapses so quietly worth remembering alongside history's grander, more famous stories. Not every crisis becomes as mythologized as Tulip Mania or the Great Depression, yet each one taught regulators, investors, and ordinary citizens something durable about risk and resilience. Small nations, ambitious cities, and rapidly growing economies each discovered, in their own way, the very same lesson older civilizations had already learned. Confidence, however useful and however necessary for genuine progress, must always be balanced gently against patience and restraint. Even the quietest, least famous collapses carry the very same ancient wisdom whispered by Sumerian clay tablets nearly 4,000 years earlier. Spanish galleons once carried so much American silver home that they nearly broke their own empire's economy. Throughout the 16th century, enormous quantities of silver mined in the Americas flowed into Spain, financing wars, palaces, and an empire stretching across multiple continents. Yet this flood of silver also drove prices steadily upward across Spain and much of Europe, an era historians now call the Price Revolution.
Spain, despite its seemingly endless silver, defaulted on its debts multiple times during this same century, having borrowed against silver shipments not yet arrived.
It is a curious, ancient irony that an empire drowning in precious metal could still, somehow, find itself unable to pay its bills on time. Imagine a Spanish treasury official, ledgers open, calculating debts already owed against silver, still crossing the Atlantic Ocean. Spanish kings repeatedly borrowed from Italian and German banking families, pledging future silver shipments as collateral for loans needed immediately. When storms, pirates, or simple delays interrupted these shipments, the crown found itself defaulting on obligations to bankers who had trusted those promised riches. Some of Europe's most powerful banking families were themselves ruined by lending too confidently against a king's silver-laden promises. Even an empire built upon literal mountains of silver, it turns out, could not entirely escape the oldest lesson in this evening's story. A single London bank's near collapse in 1890 sent a genuine chill through the entire British financial establishment. Barings Bank, one of Britain's oldest and most respected institutions, had lent heavily to Argentina, whose economy suddenly weakened amid its own financial troubles.
Facing potentially crippling losses, Barings turned to the Bank of England, which organized a rescue fund among rival banks to prevent a wider panic.
The rescue succeeded, and Barings continued operating for another century afterward, a rare example of a too-big-to-fail institution, saved just in time. It is a gentle reminder that competitors, however fierce their rivalry in ordinary times, can still quietly join hands when the wider system itself is truly at risk. In 1931, a mid-sized Austrian bank's failure helped tip an already fragile Europe deeper into the Great Depression. Creditanstalt, one of Austria's largest banks, collapsed under losses accumulated during the difficult years following the First World War.
Its failure triggered a wave of bank runs and currency crises across Central Europe, worsening a depression already spreading from across the Atlantic.
Historians consider this collapse a significant accelerant in transforming America's crisis into a genuinely global catastrophe. It is sobering to think how a single mid-sized bank in Vienna could quietly help tip an entire continent deeper into a decade of hardship. The Ottoman Empire, once a vast and wealthy realm, formally defaulted on its foreign debts in 1875, Decades of borrowing from European lenders to fund modernization, wars, and an increasingly lavish court had left the empire's finances severely overstretched.
European creditors eventually established direct control over portions of Ottoman tax revenue simply to ensure their loans were repaid.
This arrangement, while restoring some creditor confidence, deeply embarrassed the empire and fueled resentment that lingered for decades afterward. Even one of history's grandest empires, it seems, was not immune to the same quiet reckoning that humbled ancient Rome centuries before it. Imagine an Ottoman finance minister poring over ledgers late at night, watching foreign lenders slowly gain control of his empire's own tax collection. European bondholders formed an administration specifically to manage Ottoman debt repayment, effectively overseeing portions of the empire's finances directly. Ordinary Ottoman subjects experienced little direct change day to day, though the arrangement symbolized a profound loss of financial independence for the empire. Historians view this episode as an early, striking example of how deeply sovereign debt could compromise a nation's independence. It is a quiet, sobering thought that a ledger, however dry it may appear, can occasionally reshape the sovereignty of an entire empire. Nearly a century later, a much smaller nation experienced one of the strangest financial collapses in modern memory.
In 1997, ordinary citizens across Albania invested enormous portions of their savings into pyramid schemes promising extraordinary, unsustainable monthly returns. At their peak, these schemes reportedly held funds equivalent to a substantial share of the entire country's economic output.
When the schemes inevitably collapsed, widespread public anger erupted into serious unrest, briefly threatening the young democracy's stability entirely. It is a striking, modern echo of Tulip Mania and the Mississippi Company, this time playing out within a single generation's living memory. Imagine an Albanian family selling their home simply to invest the proceeds into a scheme promising to double their money within months. Government officials had offered little warning about these schemes, and some officials were even rumored to have personally profited from their operation. Losses were staggering relative to the country's modest size, touching a significant share of Albanian households when the schemes finally failed.
International intervention eventually helped stabilize the country, though public trust in financial institutions took years to genuinely rebuild.
We can hold this history with care, recognizing how deeply a simple, seductive promise of easy money can unsettle even an entire young nation. The oil price shocks of the 1970s reshaped economies worldwide in ways still felt decades later. Following disruptions to global oil supply, prices quadrupled within a short period, straining economies heavily dependent on affordable imported energy. Nations without significant oil reserves faced soaring inflation alongside slowing growth, an uncomfortable combination economists later termed stagflation. Oil exporting nations, meanwhile, accumulated enormous new wealth, some of which later flowed into the very lending that fueled Latin America's debt crisis we discussed earlier tonight. Every economic thread, it seems, eventually weaves its way quietly into another, however distant the two moments might initially appear. Imagine a driver in 1970s America waiting patiently in a long line simply to fill a car's fuel tank. Fuel shortages during this period led to rationing measures in several countries, with some governments restricting purchases to certain days based on license plate numbers. Industries dependent on cheap, plentiful energy restructured considerably, and many nations invested heavily afterward in energy efficiency and alternative sources. The crisis reshaped not just economic policy, but everyday habits, transportation choices, and even the design of automobiles for decades afterward. Sometimes an economic shock reshapes not just markets and money, but the smallest, most ordinary rhythms of daily life as well. Bengal, in the 18th century, experienced a devastating famine intertwined closely with grain markets and taxation policy.
A severe drought combined with rigid tax collection by the ruling trading company left grain reserves dangerously depleted across the region.
Grain prices soared beyond what many families could afford, even as some merchants profited considerably from the scarcity itself. Historians still debate how much administrative decisions, rather than weather alone, deepened the famine's devastating toll on the population. We can acknowledge this profound historical suffering honestly and with care, recognizing how deeply economic policy can shape whether scarcity becomes true catastrophe. Guano, the accumulated droppings of seabirds, briefly became one of South America's most valuable exports in the 19th century.
Peru's economy grew heavily dependent on exporting this valuable fertilizer to farms across Europe and North America, borrowing extensively against anticipated future guano revenues.
As guano deposits depleted and synthetic fertilizers eventually emerged, Peru's over-reliance on a single resource left its finances dangerously exposed.
The country ultimately defaulted on substantial foreign debts once guano revenues could no longer cover payments already promised to lenders.
It is an oddly humbling reminder that even the most unglamorous resource, sold with enough confidence, can inflate into an entire economy's fragile foundation. This is what makes wandering through history's lesser-known collapses so quietly rewarding alongside its most famous stories. Silver fleets, guano exports, pyramid schemes, and oil shocks each, in their own unique way, taught economies the very same lesson tulips and railways had already taught elsewhere. Wealth built upon a single fragile source, whether a resource, a scheme, or a shipment not yet arrived, tends eventually to reveal its own fragility. And in nearly every case, recovery arrived exactly as it always has throughout tonight's long story, patiently, unevenly, and only after painful lessons were finally fully absorbed. As we drift now toward the very close of our evening together, let these many stories settle gently into something more like a single, quiet understanding. Every collapse we have wandered through tonight began the same quiet, unremarkable way as an ordinary, sensible-sounding idea, a loan against next year's harvest, a coin slightly thinner than before, a flower slightly rarer than the last one, a mortgage slightly larger than seemed wise. None of these ideas felt reckless in their earliest moments, which is perhaps the most unsettling thread running through this entire evening. Recklessness, it turns out, rarely announces itself clearly. It simply accumulates, one reasonable-sounding decision layered gently upon another. There is something almost tender in recognizing how ordinary, how human, the beginning of every great collapse has always been. Imagine every era we have visited tonight as a single sleeping village, waking briefly to relearn a lesson it had somehow forgotten. Sumerian farmers, Roman merchants, Dutch tulip traders, and modern mortgage borrowers never spoke to one another across their centuries of separation. Yet each generation, quite independently, discovered the exact same fragile boundary between healthy confidence and unhealthy excess. It is as though this particular lesson cannot simply be inherited through books alone, but must be gently relearned, generation after generation, through lived experience. Perhaps this is simply the quiet cost of being human. some lessons refuse to stay learned, no matter how carefully they are written down. Recovery, across every single story tonight, required roughly the same patient ingredients, whichever century or continent hosted it. Honest acknowledgement of what had gone wrong, some form of shared sacrifice among those affected, and enough unhurried time for genuine trust to quietly regrow. No emergency law, no clever policy, and no wealthy rescuer could substitute entirely for this slow, patient rebuilding of confidence. Even the swiftest recoveries we discussed tonight, Iceland's currency rebound, South Korea's gold campaign, still required years rather than mere weeks to fully settle. There is a gentle, unhurried wisdom hidden inside every recovery. Trust simply cannot be rushed, no matter how urgently we might wish it could. This is what makes economic history, taken as a whole, feel less like a cautionary tale and more like a quiet reassurance. Civilizations that endured devastating collapses did not merely survive them, but often emerged with sturdier institutions, wiser habits, and more resilient neighbors than they had known before. Rome adapted, the Dutch Republic thrived for centuries after Tulip Mania, and Germany rebuilt itself into one of the world's most disciplined economies after its own hyperinflation.
Collapse, however painful in its immediate moment, has never once in recorded history proven to be the final chapter of any civilization's story.
Perhaps this is the gentlest lesson of all. An ending, however difficult, is very rarely the true ending. Imagine holding all 100 stories from tonight gently in one hand, like smooth stones gathered slowly along a very long shore. Each stone, on its own, tells a small, specific story: a tulip bulb, a printing press, a falling tower, a frozen bank account. Held together, they form something larger and quieter, a patient reminder that human economies have always moved in this same gentle rhythm of trust, excess, and careful rebuilding. The tide that carried each of these stones ashore is still moving tonight, quietly, patiently, exactly as it always has. There is something deeply calming in imagining yourself standing on that same ancient, unhurried shore, simply watching the water settle. It is worth remembering, as we drift now towards sleep, that most days in economic history are remarkably calm and unremarkable. For every Tulip Mania or great crash we have discussed tonight, there were countless ordinary decades of steady, quiet, unremarkable growth in between. Collapses capture our attention precisely because they are rare, dramatic exceptions rather than the ordinary rule of how economies usually behave. Most mornings, throughout most of history, markets simply opened, traded quietly, and closed again, without any story worth telling at all. There is a genuine comfort in remembering that calm, ordinary stability has always been history's true, quiet majority. Imagine a single quiet Tuesday morning, centuries ago, in any city we have visited tonight, entirely uneventful and utterly unremarkable. A merchant opens his shop, a farmer checks his fields, a banker reviews entirely ordinary ledgers, and nothing especially notable happens at all. These uncounted, unremarkable days vastly outnumber the dramatic collapses that fill our history books and, tonight, our long, gentle story. It is these quiet, ordinary days, patiently repeated, that actually build the lasting wealth and stability civilizations depend upon. Perhaps the truest economic story is not the crash at all, but the thousands of calm, unremarkable days quietly surrounding it. As our evening together draws toward its close, let these many centuries settle gently around you like a warm, familiar blanket. You have traveled tonight from Sumerian grain ledgers to Icelandic fishing villages, from Dutch tulip fields to Athens protest squares. Each story a small lantern lighting a single moment in an impossibly long human journey. Every collapse eventually gave way to recovery, and every recovery eventually gave way, in time, to the next quiet, ordinary chapter of growth. There is nothing left to solve, nothing left to calculate, nothing left for you to carry forward tonight except a soft, settled sense of how enduring, how patient, and how resilient human economies have always been. Let that patient resilience become the last thought you carry gently with you, as your own evening now drifts quietly toward its close. During the French Revolution, a new paper currency called the assignat was meant to solve the young republic's desperate need for funds.
Backed initially by seized church lands, the assignat was issued in growing quantities to finance the revolutionary government's mounting expenses and ongoing wars.
As printing accelerated far beyond what the underlying land could reasonably support, the currency's value collapsed steadily across several years. By the mid-1790s, assignats had become so worthless that France largely abandoned paper currency entirely for the following several decades. It is a quiet historical footnote that revolutionary idealism, however sincere, could not fully protect a currency from the same old arithmetic of printing too much, too quickly. Imagine a Parisian baker in 1795 refusing paper assignats entirely and demanding payment only in coin. Merchants across France increasingly insisted on gold, silver, or barter rather than accept a currency that lost value visibly from morning to evening. The revolutionary government experimented with price controls and even the guillotine as punishment for currency speculation, measures that ultimately failed to restore the assignat's value. France's later adoption of a stable gold-backed currency under Napoleon partly reflected lessons drawn painfully from this earlier collapse. Even amid the drama of revolution, the oldest economic lesson quietly persisted. Trust in money cannot be legislated into existence by decree alone. During the American Civil War, the Confederate States issued paper currency that would ultimately become almost entirely worthless. Lacking gold reserves and facing a lengthening, costly war, the Confederate government printed increasing quantities of paper notes to fund its military effort.
As the war's outcome grew uncertain and eventually turned against the Confederacy, confidence in this currency collapsed steadily alongside its military prospects.
By the war's end in 1865, Confederate currency had become essentially worthless, wiping out savings held by countless Southern families.
We can acknowledge this history honestly and with care, recognizing how deeply a currency's fate can become entangled with a nation's broader fortunes. A London bank's failure in 1866 sent a wave of panic through Britain's financial markets, echoing crises we have already followed tonight.
Overend, Gurney and Company, once among London's most respected financial institutions, had shifted from cautious lending into far riskier ventures during its final years. When these risky investments soured, the firm collapsed dramatically, triggering a broader panic across British banks reliant on similar short-term lending.
The Bank of England ultimately stepped in to calm the crisis, an early example of a central bank acting deliberately as a steadying hand for the wider system. It is a familiar shape by now. A trusted institution grows careless during good years, and the entire system briefly trembles once that carelessness comes due. In 1982, a small Gulf nation's informal stock exchange collapsed under the weight of billions in post-dated personal checks.
Kuwait's Souk al-Manak, an unofficial trading market, had allowed investors to buy shares in local companies using checks post-dated months into the future, effectively creating enormous informal credit. Share prices soared dramatically as investors traded increasingly speculative paper, confident that rising prices would always cover their post-dated obligations. When the market finally collapsed, the total value of unpaid checks reportedly exceeded the country's entire annual budget at the time. It is a striking, modern echo of Dutch tulip contracts 3 centuries earlier, this time written on checks instead of paper promises for flowers. Imagine a Kuwaiti trader holding a thick folder of post-dated checks, each one representing a promise now clearly impossible to keep. The Kuwaiti government eventually established a special tribunal specifically to untangle the enormous web of unpaid obligations across thousands of individual traders. Resolving the crisis took years, straining relationships among prominent local families whose fortunes had become tightly, sometimes uncomfortably, intertwined. The episode remains a distinctive case study in how quickly an informal market, however small, can generate genuinely enormous paper obligations. Even in a market built almost entirely on personal checks rather than institutions, the same ancient rhythm of confidence and collapse still, quietly, played itself out. This is what makes gathering so many collapses together, across so many centuries and continents, feel less overwhelming and more oddly comforting. French assignats, Confederate dollars, London banking houses, and Kuwaiti post-dated checks each, in their own time and place, taught precisely the same lesson older civilizations had already learned and would, inevitably, teach again. No currency, however revolutionary its origins, and no market, however informal its structure, has ever proven entirely immune to this same ancient rhythm. Yet in every single case, without exception, the affected community found its way, eventually, back towards stability and ordinary life. That, more than any single crash or currency, is the truest lesson this long evening has to offer. Not every collapse tonight involved a whole market or a whole nation. Some began with the careful lies of a single company. In 2001, an American energy company called Enron collapsed within weeks after investigators uncovered years of hidden debts disguised through complex accounting arrangements. Thousands of employees lost both their jobs and much of their retirement savings, which had been heavily invested in the company's own now worthless shares. The scandal led directly to new accounting and auditing regulations, meant to prevent similarly hidden corporate debts from escaping notice again. It is a quiet, unsettling reminder that sometimes a collapse begins not with too much confidence, but with too little honesty. Imagine an accountant, late at night, quietly moving numbers between spreadsheets to keep a company's true condition hidden from view. Enron's collapse revealed an elaborate structure of off-the-books partnerships designed specifically to hide mounting losses from investors, employees, and regulators alike. A similarly large telecommunications company, WorldCom, collapsed the following year after auditors discovered billions of dollars in expenses improperly disguised as long-term investments. Together, these scandals shook public confidence in corporate accounting itself, prompting sweeping reforms to how companies reported their finances. Sometimes the most important safeguard an economy can build is not against excessive optimism, but simply against carefully hidden dishonesty. Years later, one of the largest frauds in financial history quietly unraveled just as markets were already reeling from the 2008 crisis. Bernard Madoff, a once respected figure on Wall Street, had for decades operated an elaborate scheme, paying early investors with money collected from newer ones.
rather than any genuine investment returns.
The scheme finally collapsed when the broader financial crisis prompted investors to withdraw funds faster than new money could arrive to replace it.
Losses were later estimated at many billions of dollars, touching individuals, charities, and institutions who had trusted his reputation for decades. It is a sobering reminder that even the most sophisticated modern markets remain vulnerable to the oldest trick in this entire evening's story, paying yesterday's promise with tomorrow's hopeful new believer. This is what makes corporate scandals feel like such a distinct thread woven throughout tonight's much larger tapestry. Unlike tulip bulbs or railway shares, these collapses were not fueled primarily by crowds of hopeful believers, but by a small handful of individuals choosing, deliberately, to deceive. Yet the resulting damage rippled outward in achingly familiar ways. Lost savings, shaken confidence, and years of careful regulatory rebuilding.
Each scandal, in its own quiet way, added another brick to the same slow wall of investor protections built up across this entire evening's history.
Even deception, it seems, eventually teaches an economy something useful, however painful the lesson felt to those who paid its price directly. And so our long evening together slowly draws to its close. We began beside Sumerian riverbanks, watching kings forgive impossible debts with a single royal decree, and wandered slowly forward through Roman coins growing thinner, through tulip fields glowing briefly brighter than gold. We sat quietly beside Dutch tavern tables and Parisian crowds cheering paper riches, then walked through smoke-filled railway offices and crowded American banks with their doors quietly bolted shut. We stood together in bread lines during the Great Depression, in Weimar streets where wheelbarrows carried more cash than bread, and in Buenos Aires, kitchens filled with the gentle clatter of pots and pans. We watched Tokyo's glittering towers rise and dim, dot-com fortunes bloom and fade, and a single September morning in 2008, when an old Wall Street name simply disappeared. Through every single one of these 100 stories, the same soft truth kept gently returning. Confidence rises, confidence falls, and trust, patiently rebuilt, always finds its way home again. If these long, slow wanderings through economic history are helping guide you towards sleep, consider leaving this video a quiet like, or subscribing so more evenings like this one can find you. And if you are still awake, there is always another gentle story waiting for you whenever you are ready. For now, let your jaw loosen, let your shoulders melt a little further into whatever is holding you, and let your breathing grow slow, even, and unhurried. Picture a quiet evening light, dimming gently over some ancient harbor, ships resting still upon calm water, ledgers finally closed for the night. Let every number, every worry, every unfinished thought settle quietly now, like dust finally allowed to rest. Sleep well and good night.